We've just got one more speaker in this session, which is Catherine Menon. So Catherine, if you'd like to come and join me up here, please. And while she gets set up, I'll just say a few words. She's a principal lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. Her research looks at the use of software in safety critical systems, particularly autonomous systems. She previously worked with safety critical systems in the defense and nuclear sector and has been involved in producing and validating several international standards for these domains. She's a member of the BSI AMT10 and AMT10-1 committees, which provide UK input into ISO TC 299 and BS 8611, which for those of you who are not familiar, are all about robotics and ethical use of them and standardization, etc. She's also a member of the IEE P7009 working group, currently developing a standard for fail-safe mechanisms in autonomous systems. She's a founding member of the Safety of Autonomous Systems Working Group, as well as a member of the IET Technical Committee developing the Code of Practice for Cyber Security and Safety. And because she attends all of those committees and meetings, she has therefore accumulated a number of stories which she now wants to relate to us. Catherine.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Graham. I'm going to talk to you about our use of stories and narratives in safety engineering. And this is some work that I've been doing with a collaborator, Austin Rayner, at University of Belfast. So, as a brief introduction, as Graham said, I tend to work on things that look like these. So, on the right, we have the BSI standard 8611 for ethical design and application of robotic devices. In the middle, we have an assurance case template. So this is for an argument that your system follows ethical principles. So it's essentially an ethical assurance case as opposed to a safety assurance case. And on the left, we have some of the robots in the robot house at Hertfordshire. So you can see we've got a pepper robot and some more factory looking robots. So far, so fairly standard. I also work on things that look a bit more like these. So I write novels, write literary fiction. I also run workshops for creative writing. So teaching people how to write, teaching people how to analyze stories, how to create stories. I'm fairly sure that there are other people in this room who also do similar things. From what I've noticed, safety engineers often seem to have these really amazing dual lives. So if you look at the person sitting next to you, they're probably a secret trapeze artist or something. If you ask Mike very nicely, he will, I'm sure, organize a trapeze act for your next SSS. But for now, you're stuck with me, and I am going to tell you about stories for the next slot. So when I came to write this presentation, I thought, well, let's go back to first principles. If I'm going to talk about stories, well, what exactly is a story? So I turned to this chap who is quite fetching in black and white. He is Donald Polkinghorne, and he is a psychologist. He says that storytelling is a type of discourse production that preserves the complexity of human action with its interrelationship of temporal sequence, human motivation, chance happenings, and changing interpersonal and environmental contexts. Well, that's great. With no disrespect intended to Mr. Polkinghorne, I'm not entirely convinced this really gets us further forward. So I thought, let's look at something else. This chap is Sir Terry Pratchett, who was an author, and he says instead that when he's characterizing stories or fantasy, that humans need fantasy to be human, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Okay, so that's a slightly different perspective. I am still not really sure, again, with apologies to Sir Terry, that this really moves us from our base position. We can't very well go about peppering our safety cases with reference to apes and angels and so forth. So let's have a look from first principles. Let's make our own definition. So firstly, what do we think stories are here to do? If someone's telling you a story, chances are that they're telling you that story primarily perhaps to entertain you, so to pass a few minutes to entertain your kids at bedtime. Perhaps they are telling you the story to educate you. So perhaps the purpose of this story and the way in which you should interpret it and the way in which you should contextualize it is that you are drawing some sort of lesson from the story. Or more nuanced, perhaps the story is not to teach you a lesson, but to help you understand a lesson yourself. So the story is not intended to be didactic, to tell you exactly this is how the world works, but to say to you, come with me and we will explore together so that you understand how the world works. And this is the definition that I'm going to be talking about because it's most relevant to us in the safety critical engineering profession. So having said that, the first thing I'm going to do is to tell you a story. So you can all start to have a nice little nap because I'm going to tell you that once upon a time, there were two children called Hansel and Gretel. They lived in a wood with a very poor woodcutter who was their father and a wicked stepmother. Now, the wicked stepmother persuaded the poor woodcutter to take his children out to the woods and leave them there because it was very expensive to keep them. The woodcutter, who was apparently a very easily led young man, agreed, and modulo a bit of toing and froing, we now have the children wandering around being lost in the wood. The next thing that happens is that the children come across a house made entirely of gingerbread. Fair enough. You can see here, this is a picture by Arthur Rackham. You probably can't see very well, actually, but the panes are made of sugar and the roof of the house is some sort of sweet bun. The children start to demolish the house, they start to eat it, and the owner of the house, a wicked witch, comes out, is not very pleased with this, and sweeps them inside, where she tells them that she's going to keep them captive, fatten them up, and then she's going to eat them. The children eventually overcome her. They push her into her own oven and burn her to death, and then return to their father's cottage where their stepmother has conveniently died of some horrible wasting disease, and they can live happily ever after. The end. So, apart from being extraordinarily unsuitable as a story to tell children, what is the purpose of this story? What's it telling us about? So on one level, this is a story about two children who are in a wood and they eat a gingerbread house. This is the story in the absolute fact in which it's presented. But we as adults, as safety engineers, are used to looking beyond the facts. So if we look beyond the facts, what is the context in which we should interpret this story? What is this story actually telling us? How should we take a perspective on this story to understand it? Well, perhaps this story is in fact not a story about two children eating gingerbread. Perhaps the two children eating gingerbread should be interpreted in the context of something like stranger danger. Perhaps, I'm not sure this is working anymore, is it? Oh, it is, okay. I'll just get used to the sound of my own voice. How wonderful. Perhaps this is a story about the ways in which we should teach our children that the world can be hostile, the ways in which our children need to look out for hidden hazards, look out for ways in which they can reduce the risk associated with their world. Or perhaps this isn't a story about stranger danger. Perhaps if you read some literary critiques, this is in fact a story about the way women's power has historically been viewed, that in every story you need to have a villain, and that a woman who wields power has traditionally been seen as in some way supernatural or terrifying or wicked. Now, you might choose any of those interpretations, you might choose all of them. But when we tell stories in safety engineering, what we're doing is we are telling a story and we're expecting the reader or the listener to be able to interpret that story within the context which we have provided for them. So that's a mouthful of words. Let's have a look at some examples. So we've already talked about use case scenarios so far, and how we might tell these as stories in safety engineering. So when we tell stories that are use case scenarios, the world we're in is a world of fluffy white clouds. So if I am discussing a use case scenario with you, I am describing an ideal world. This is the world I want. This is exactly how it ought to be. This is predictable. Users will always use the system in this way. They will never take any shortcuts, skip a step. They'll never try and game the system, and the system will work perfectly to allow them to do this. This is a world where I can plan for the future. This is a world where I can be assured that I will get what I want. And this is a world where we all skip off into the sunset and dance around maypoles. We have our happy ending. Now, we've already heard people discuss why use case scenarios should, in fact, talk about things that went wrong. Perhaps use case scenarios should be a little bit more like war stories. So when we tell war stories, when we get together over a drink at the end of this session and we tell war stories about a system we're involved in, a system that we were involved in developing, we are in a world of quite black clouds. We are in the real world, unfortunately. We're talking about what went wrong. We're talking about what was unpredictable. Nobody tells a war story about something that went right. Nobody goes into the bar and says, let me tell you about the time my project went 100% right. Or if they do, nobody wants to drink with them. So we are reminiscing, we're sharing what went wrong. But the implication that we don't often think about with war stories is that by telling them, we are through the difficulty. Again, you don't tell a war story about a war you're still currently fighting. There is the implication that we have fixed this system. This will not occur again. So either we have developed a system which got over those problems, or we decided we didn't need the system to begin with. But the problems which we are describing are generally not problems which we will expect to see in every single project. Otherwise, we wouldn't bother describing them. The other type of story that we tend to tell is a safety argument. So are these white fluffy clouds or are these big black clouds? And the answer to this is very ambiguous, very waffly. It depends how you tell them. So let's take, for example, a safety argument where the premise, you as a safety engineer have come up with the premise that I am going to demonstrate that the system is safe. Well, at the very least, this is a light grey cloud. Sorry. Is that better? Hello? Fantastic. This is now a story about how I have broken 2 items of text so far. So, if we are arguing, if we are presenting a safety argument with the premise that we are demonstrating the system is safe, as I said, we have at the very least a light grey cloud. Because as a reader, if I come across an argument that tells me it is going to demonstrate that the system is safe, I'm immediately going to think it is probably not going to lay an enormous amount of emphasis on counter-evidence. You don't start a demonstration that the system is safe by telling everybody about here's all the evidence that shows it's not safe. It is probably also not going to talk about a situation where the environment of the system must remain restricted in order for the system to be safe. It's certainly not going to talk about insufficient evidence, lack of traceability, and lack of rigor. And because I, as a reader, am expecting a demonstration that the system is safe, I'm also not going to think to demand evidence that I do have traceability. So together we have essentially connived at a fiction here. What about an alternate form of safety argument? I have seen some people present these. I have seen people present a safety argument as justifying my decision that the system is safe. Well, good heavens. If the previous one was a light grey cloud, this one is a big black cloud that is throwing thunder and lightning down. And the reason for that is that you should never trust the eye. So if I am justifying a decision which I have made, then I am again going to not be focusing on the ways in which that decision is wrong. So one thing I actually tell my students in creative writing workshops is if you have a piece of fiction that's written in first person or that foregrounds one particular character or one particular narrator, you must interrogate that to ensure that the narrator is reliable. You should also be doing this with safety arguments. So we are all egotists. Not least of which, Vaughan Williams, I think this quote adequately illustrates that, on being challenged about a particular note in his Symphony No. 4, which all the players thought was wrong. He stood his ground, he stared them down, and he said, it looks wrong and it sounds wrong, but it's right. I have seen people attempt to defend their safety arguments in the same way. So, having told you what a safety argument mustn't be, let's be a little more productive. What perhaps should a safety argument be? Well, I would argue that a safety argument should instead be about exploration. A safety argument should be able to be led by the reader as much as it is led by the author. So in other words, a safety argument is exploring the safety of the system. It's open to possibility. The outcome of this argument may be that the system is safe, but equally it may be that the system is unsafe. In other words, we would do worse than model our safety arguments on, I don't know if these books even exist in the UK, these they do, fantastic, choose your own adventure books, which I'm sure we've all read as kids, where you can navigate your way through the book, choosing which outcome you would like. Do you want to try and find a path through this book that tells you that the hero dies? Well, if you want to, you can try and work that out. You can attempt to construct a premise of the book where the hero dies. So with that in mind, your readers of your safety argument should also be able to construct a premise from which they assume the system is unsafe and they can work through your argument in the same way. Now, this is all, of course, complicated by the fact that we don't just tell stories to other safety engineers. We tell stories to regulators. Hopefully we don't tell stories in the sense of fibs, but we do communicate with regulators. We communicate with engineers from other disciplines. Sometimes we have to talk to software engineers. Sometimes we have to talk to human factors experts. We have to talk to users, and we have to communicate with the general public. Now, it's this last thing, I think, that gives us as safety engineers an inordinate amount of power in the stories that we tell. So with our stories, we can frame the public's responses to situations. So when we talk about autonomous vehicles, we don't really talk about risk management criteria, about risk tolerability. If we're talking to the general public, we talk about the school bus of nuns versus the truckload of children, as though those things happen in everyday life. We ask them to read the story of autonomous vehicles as a fight between the evil nuns and the good children, or something like that. We frame the public's response to situations in terms of heroes and happy endings. So I'm sure you all recognize this. This is the Hudson Bay crash. This is, I did a search for news articles about this, not in specialist engineering publications, but in mainstream media. And in really all of them, this is presented as a triumph. This is good. This is the outcome we wanted. Now, I don't know about you, but an aircraft landing in water and having to make an emergency evacuation is not actually the outcome that we want when we design the aircraft. This may be a story of a hero, but it is not a story of a happy ending. And we also tell stories about individual and collective responsibility. So I'm sure, again, people recognize these two photos. One is of a Nimrod and one is of the Chinook crash on the Mull of Kintyre. So the Nimrod crash was analysed in the Haddon Cave report in immense detail, which apportioned collective responsibility as well as individual responsibility. Now, obviously, as you all know, the initial report on the crash of the Mull of Kintyre was pretty much a hatchet job on the pilots. You know, this is your fault, you were negligent, until it was overturned. So the way in which we communicate findings can frame the public's response to situations and can encourage the public to think in certain ways about our situations. So this little chap here, who looks a bit worried, quite frankly, should be us when we are using stories in safety engineering. Why should we be that worried? Well, basically, because, as Anderson, Schwamm, and Twining, who are lawyers, say, stories are wonderful vessels for cheating in the process of persuasion. If you want to cheat someone, you begin by telling them a story, because people believe emotions over facts. A really good legal example of this is summed up in the phrase, Mrs. Thompson was hanged for immorality. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. It was a fairly landmark legal case. Edith Thompson in the 1920s was married. She was conducting an affair with a younger man who met her and her husband at one point after they came out from the cinema and stabbed the husband. The husband died, and both Edith Thompson and her lover, a chap called Bywaters, were indicted for murder. Now, throughout the entire case, the lover, Bywaters, was steadfast that Edith Thompson had known nothing of his plans to stab her husband. Edith Thompson said she knew nothing of them. There was no evidence that she had anything to do with this particular setup of stabbing. There was no evidence that she knew anything about it. But the prosecutor told a story, and the story that the prosecutor told was not a story about a murderer. It was a story about a wicked woman who committed adultery. Now, remember, this was the 1920s, morality was a bit more of a stricture, and because of this story about Mrs. Thompson, Edith Thompson was found guilty of murder, guilty of adultery, if that had been a possibility, and she was hanged on the 9th of January, 1923. So since then, moving back into safety engineering, 60 years later, after Edith Thompson's death, we have the Korean Airlines flight crash, which killed 269 people. 80 years later, we have the Daegu subway fire, killing 192. We have 80 years later as well, bad year, we have the Columbia disaster, killing 7, very high profile. And then 90 years later, we have the Dhaka garment factory collapse in Bangladesh, killing 1,134. So I'm sure that you can think of stories which have been told about every single one of these accidents, which place the blame on an individual, which frame something as a happy ending, which interpret the story in a particular way. I'm sure you can find a story about every single one of these accidents, which is the equivalent to the story that the prosecutor told about Mrs. Thompson. So the moral, to finish off with, possibly on time, possibly not, is continue telling stories, because stories are how we communicate. But as the little dragon says, tell your stories safely.
Thanks very much. Is this on? Yeah. Thanks very much, Catherine. You're a wonderful storyteller. I'm sure there might be a few people who have some questions. Let's take a few questions. Got anything online? Has anybody got any questions in the room? Which counts. Rather than repeat your question, if you just speak a little more, we'll hand it to you.
Hi, Robert Stroud from Mountain. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for a really interesting talk. Just wondering how you're going to, what your advice would be for how one tells stories safely. How do you tell your story without letting your own prejudices and biases and whatever control, and therefore fall into the possibilities trap that you mentioned just now?
Yes. So thanks for the question. I think it's a really good question. How do we tell stories without bias? From a safety engineering perspective, I'm actually a fan of the idea, which has been, it's not my idea, obviously been proposed lots of times before, that instead of creating a safety argument, we should be creating the anti-argument. We should be creating the argument that the system is unsafe. We should be trying as hard as we can to create the argument that says, this is why this system is unsafe. This is why it's unreliable. Let me show you in excruciating detail why your system is going to fail. Because if we work to create that and we make that as compelling as possible, in addition to our safety case, then we have more of a two sides of the coin for a regulator or for the general public, most tellingly, to be able to access. So I'm a fan of forcing us to do the thing that we actually very much don't want to do.
Hang on a minute, Robert. I shouldn't have left you so quickly.
You should, if you knew me better, you wouldn't have left me. I always come back with a follow-up. Yes, no, that's a very interesting point. I heard a presentation from somebody at the SEI CMU about a form of notation they had, and I said, where's the argument? And essentially their argument was, it's safe because it was exactly that. They excluded all the things that might go wrong and therefore concluded that they couldn't think of anything else that might go wrong, therefore it was okay. As you may be aware, the Assurance 2 methodology that we're developing is specifically looking at what we call defeaters, which, if you like, counter arguments. So I think this is a good approach. And as you say, if you can persuade somebody that you've thought of all the bad things that can go wrong, then maybe they'll be more convinced that it's safe.
Yes, I think trying to persuade people that things will go wrong is always more conducive to figuring out yourself that they are going to go right.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question before we hand over to Dewi for the next session. Anybody else got anything? Anybody online? Mike.
Catherine, that was great talk. Thank you very much. I just thought it's very interesting your reference to the legal profession, because actually they do use stories all the time. And I was involved in a murder trial, in fact, on the jury, where each of the prosecution and the defense weaved a story to try and explain to us why we should control it. And I thought it was really, really convincing. And to be honest, you end up completely compelling arguments on both sides. You think, well, how am I going to decide, you know? But I think that's what you have to do. And I think that's what you're saying. So thank you very much. Yeah.
No, thank you. I think the really important point to emphasize is that presumably they were weaving these stories with the same facts. evidence. You know, presumably that the prosecutor hadn't said, well, let's suppose that our accused was in the room at the time. So with the same facts, you can weave two completely different stories. So I'm not saying ignore your evidence. I'm saying look at your evidence and really interrogate which story you're putting together with it, because you might find it more useful to convince yourself if you put together the opposite one.
Right, thank you very much, Catherine. I'm sure all of us here as safety engineers and those online probably already realise that part of the art of safety engineering is communication, and that could have been no better demonstrated than what Catherine presented this afternoon. So I'd like you all to show your appreciation for her, please.